All right, looking at chapter 24 today, the railroad chapter. You can see by my font there that some don't find it the most exciting chapter, so I tried to get you excited before it actually started. So this is all about the railroads. So when railroads began being constructed in our country, it becomes pretty obvious that they are a bit too expensive for private building. Now you may recall in the Civil War chapter that there was the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 that began the building of our transcontinental railroad. Once that was completed, we realized that private companies could not actually handle it, so we continued to have the government provide that as well. The issue is that our government also did not have a lot of money, and so what they decided to do is rather than grant them money and finance it with cash, instead they provided them with land grants. What ended up happening is once companies were done building their railroads, they realized that land was far more valuable than actually running the railroad itself. So what they decided to do is lobby Congress and in many cases bribe Congress, get as much land as possible, finish building the railroad, sell the railroad off and the land, and then the businessmen would keep the land and the profits from it while the railroad actually went bankrupt. Luckily, we have a president who fights against corruption in Grover Cleveland, and he ends a practice in 1887. Despite the fact that railroads became a massive source of corruption, like most things in the Gilded Age, there are many positives that come from them, including connecting the nation, allowing us to grow. Connecting all these areas together leads to further immense growth with as a nation, as far as our population and economically speaking. And also, the land being worth the money because of rails, not vice versa, leads to people moving out west as well as creating more tax revenue. Anyway, here is a map of all of the railroads that we build. You can see the Union Pacific Railroad in the center there, going through Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada to California. That was the first one. All these other railroads are added later on. You can also see the pattern of land grants. You can see the checkered pattern in the lands that they would be able to sell off for profit. You can also see that America builds a lot more railroads than other regions in the world. You may think maybe it's because of the corruption or because of the profits, but really it's because we needed a lot of rails to connect all of our nation together. So let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad was built after being passed in law in 1862. While the South was absent, they were finally able to agree to build a railroad across the country because they could build it further north. Its construction began in 1865 when they finally had the funding and men available to build it. It was provided funding by Credit Mobilier, a banking company owned by several congressmen. And that financing company ended up stealing a lot of money from our nation, which is another example of that corruption. The people who built this railroad were primarily made up of immigrant labor forces. The Irish built from the east, headed west, and starting in California, which is the most dangerous work going through the mountains. Many Chinese laborers worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. And so you have these two immigrant labor forces building this railroad. Here's a picture of them meeting at Promontory Summit in Utah, the completion of connecting our nation from sea to shining sea through the railroad. And so, in a way, you could almost say that this is the completion of Manifest Destiny. Not only do we own the land, but now we also connect it through one mode of transportation. So the railroads continue to develop after this because even though some of them did not make much money and were sold off for the land, they were very profitable in the sense that it helped get goods traveling back and forth and also brought people out west. And so many railroads were built throughout the 1800s. Four other transcontinental railroads were completed: the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, and the Atchison. Only one of those, however, was actually proven to be financially successful long term. That's because James J. Hill focused on helping people by providing land that was affordable, by providing and selling land to immigrants and making it affordable. That meant that a lot of people would settle along his railroads, meaning that a lot of people would also finance his railroads by shipping things and traveling on those rails. He also was the first to think about two-way shipping. Rather than shipping things just from the east to the west and then coming back empty-handed, he instead decided to bring things back from the west coast to sell to the east and vice versa, and thus he made his rails way more profitable. Then we have someone who's considered, well, unfortunately, one of our meanest people, but his name's Cornelius Vanderbilt. And what he decides is he's called the Commodore because he originally controlled a massive amount of shipping by boats on the East Coast. But when he sees the potential of railroads, he sells all of his fleet off and instead decides to purchase the rails going from Chicago to New York. This allows him to make a lot of money. As you could imagine, there's a lot of commerce and travel going between those cities in that region. He also brings some other positive changes, including creating a standard rail size and using only steel to create his rails. That made it a lot safer. The standard rail size enables him to connect cities. It used to be just kind of separate rails would go from one city to another, and you would have to hop off, say, from Columbia to Franklin. You would have to hop off and then get on another train go from Franklin to Nashville because the rail sizes weren't the same and they didn't even hardly connect. And so Cornelius Vanderbilt standardizes and makes a lot of money. Many other people invent things that make a ton of money off of it as well, as with any industry. George Westinghouse creates the air brake, which allows them to stop the train much faster and saves a lot of lives. And you have the Pullman Palace cars, which were extremely fancy. When people traveled out west or back to the east, they would rent these cars that were plush with velvet and candles and bedding. The problem is that accidents were quite dangerous, and especially if you're sitting and sleeping in a Pullman Palace car, there was a lot of fabric that would catch fire. Regardless, Westinghouse and Pullman made a lot of money off of the railroad industry. Societal changes are also brought by the rails. It became the nation's biggest business and spurred massive economic growth. And trains, we tend to only focus on the one product that you see, but the thing about anything like cars, you have lots of these extra industries that are built off of it. So when you look at the trains, they brought raw materials. They helped fund and support factories. Other markets were created. If you're building a lot of rails, then there's a lot of demand for steel and other minerals as well. Also, bringing people the opportunity to head out west stimulated the mining and agricultural economies, created the boom towns and ghost towns. So, whenever we would find silver or gold somewhere, people would flood that city, mine it. It would become a boom town. And maybe for 30, 40 years would have a lot of money. But then once the minerals ran out, people would then leave, forcing it to become a ghost town. It also encouraged immigration to our country, both internal immigration from region to region and also from other nations coming to America. May not surprise you, we also have ecological changes come. Lumber is cleared out. Buffalo are nearly wiped out. Settlers flood the Great Plains, completely changing that landscape. And as we'll get to in a future chapter, natives were also very disrupted and upset by it. And this leads to an increase in Indian wars. And eventually by 1890, the forcing of nearly every Native American tribe onto reservations. This 1885 picture here depicts Cornelius Vanderbilt in his most famous statement. When people complained about him charging too much money and for him being cruel to those who competed with him, all he had to say was, "The public be damned." He didn't care how much he was charging or how much he was making. To him, he provided a service and was making money, and it didn't matter how much other people had to pay. So this kind of tells you the idea behind the phrase robber barons. The idea of robber barons is that these men who claim to be providing some kind of benefit to society were actually robbing us, and not only by hurting us in our pocketbooks, but also by controlling our politicians, Congress, and legislatures through their bribes. So men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, despite building these rails and in many ways helping our country, were viewed negatively because they're viewed as greedy. Consider Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon. He provides quite a service for us, but others view him as a greedy man who is crushing his opponents, not paying his workers very much. He's viewed negatively because of the amount of wealth that he has accumulated. So, wrongdoing in railroading, Cornelius Vanderbilt was not the only one. Jay Gould, who I mentioned in a previous chapter, what he would do is he would go around and he would build a newspaper, and he would market his railroad as something that everyone should invest in. By the time everyone poured money into his railroad, he would only have built a couple miles of track. He would take their money and he would leave them without a completed railroad. And then he would go on to the next city and do the exact same thing. So, this massive amount of corruption and really cruelty and selfishness, greed, whatever you want to call it, was quite prevalent. Vanderbilt and others also, as I mentioned just a second ago, lavished politicians and businessmen with benefits, giving them cuts, giving them what they called rebates. This forced many Americans to view railroads negatively. Although the transportation was great, it was obviously being used unfairly. So farmers then, what they did out west is they pushed for state legislatures to pass laws that would restrict railroads. In the Wabash decision, however, if you remember going all the way back to our discussion of the amendments, we know in the 10th Amendment that any power not granted to the federal government It's granted to others. But John Marshall decides that who has control over interstate commerce? The federal government does. So if a railroad goes between states, although farmers had convinced their state legislatures to pass laws controlling the railroads, Congress canceled those decisions out through this Supreme Court decision. So the Wabash decision stops farmers from being able to use their state powers and their state legislatures to stop from being abused by these powerful men like Jay Gould and Vanderbilt. 1887, Congress also creates the Interstate Commerce Act, prohibiting rebates and pools. Pools are where other railroad companies would decide to charge the same ridiculous rate to everyone. Because, let's say, all four of the railroads in the northern part of our country, if all four charged the same rates, well, that meant that they would all make a lot of profit because there was no way to break out from under it. Recently, I don't know if you knew this, but all of the airlines were actually charged in America for all agreeing to charge ridiculous rates. And so the government stepped in, much like they did back in 1887, to try to stop that from happening and force them to openly publish their rates. Anyway, the point being is that the states were unable to control them, and the federal government does step in to try to control them a little bit. Unfortunately, they're not as successful, and this railroad abuse will continue all the way into the 1900s. So, one major theme of the Gilded Age and throughout this time period, one is corruption, yes, but if you look at it from the outer view, so the whole idea of the Gilded Age is that our nation was covered in a thin layer of gold, and everything looked rosy and good to everyone outside of our country. This is kind of the idea that, our nation was benefiting greatly economically and becoming a powerhouse. So you can see on this slide, the U.S. went from fourth to first in world manufacturing by 1890. What enabled all of this to happen? Well, there's a lot of different factors that allow that. You can never just look at one. Unfortunately, today we kind of tend to say, who's president? He must be responsible for it. But it goes far beyond just one political figure. So what enabled America to be the most successful? We had a mass amount of transportation moving people and goods around our nation quickly. We also have a ton of natural resources. Nobody had messed with the metals and other resources of our nation until we got here. And so that abundant amount of resources that nobody else was competing for was very beneficial. Liquid capital is the idea that people had money to spend and to invest in these enterprises. So that also helps. We also have the creativity of men like Thomas Edison, creating things like light bulbs, Westinghouse, creating the air brakes, other people using steel to create lots of things. We also have the ability to mass produce these inventions. So steel is able to be mass produced, light bulbs able to be mass produced, all these things produced quite quickly. And then finally, the amount of immigrants coming to our nation every year, combined with the already abundant amount of workers we have in our country, creates a large labor source which makes all this possible. So it's never just one thing that makes a nation economically successful. And so we look at all these different factors for why America went from fourth to first in manufacturing. Here's a picture of Thomas Alva Edison in his lab, Wizard of Menlo Park. He invented, as you can see, a lot of stuff, or at least the people working for him did. Anyways, the trust titan emerges. Who is this man? This is Andrew Carnegie. He's one of three major industrial leaders during this time period. What he did is he established a hold of the steel industry by using vertical integration. Basically, that means that he controls every phase of manufacturing steel. He controls the mines where they get the minerals to make steel. He controls the shipping to bring all his materials where he needs it. He controls the factories which manufacture the steel, and then he also controls the marketing to sell and reach out to people to purchase it. So by controlling all this, not only does he control quality, he also eliminates anyone else making money off of his product. So Andrew Carnegie becomes the king of the steel industry. And since steel was used to make rails and to build skyscrapers, you can understand why Andrew Carnegie became one of the richest men in our history. Then you have John D. Rockefeller. This man is known for his power in the oil industry. He is able to own eventually 90% of the oil refinery industry. His most famous invention was horizontal integration, also known as the trust. What he did is if someone was competing with him, he would purchase 51% of the share in their company, and that allowed him to control basically control the company, and then basically continue establishing a monopoly in that industry. So if the rival would not sell or give control to Rockefeller, he instead would crush them through many other means, which we'll talk about in a second. So a trust is where you control your weaker rivals by purchasing the controlling share of that company's stocks. Then finally, J.P. Morgan. I mentioned him in a previous chapter because he is the man who bailed out our nation. He's the banker who is able to loan America enough gold to be successful. So J.P. Morgan developed something also known as the interlocking directorate. where even though he owned his own businesses, he would place men on the board of directors of many major businesses. So going back to that idea of railroads and the fact that you have four railroads charging an exorbitant price or a ridiculous price, that's what he would do. He would put his people on the boards of those railroads, and that would get them to cooperate, and they would cooperate by ripping off all the American people. All the companies would benefit economically, and he would move on to another industry, continually growing his profits at the expense of everybody else. So building monopolies, controlling all the wealth. In 1900, Morgan and Carnegie were competing in the steel industry. These two men decide to allow Carnegie to retire. Morgan says, "What will it take to get you out of the steel business?" He says, "Buy it for 400 million." And Morgan says, "Sure, I will absolutely do that." So Carnegie steps out, sells his steel business to Morgan, who consolidates all of those steel companies together, and he is able to create the first U.S. company worth over $1 billion. So we have a monopoly in the steel industry, which will eventually be broken apart in a future era. But in this era, there was simply no competitors to J.P. Morgan. In the petroleum industry, you have Rockefeller deciding it's just not worth it hunting for petroleum and oil. Even though there had been a massive oil boom, it took a lot of time to find oil. And so Rockefeller decides, why hunt for oil if I can be the one who cleans it up for them? So by 1877, he was wisely able to own all 95% of all U.S. refineries. So the oil boom, nearly all of that oil went through his own refineries, and then he would sell it for a profit. Pretty brilliant. So how did he build this? As I mentioned before, he would buy out his competitors. If they would not sell their businesses to him, he would bribe railroad companies. One of his most famous things that he did is he gathered together all of the oil companies in Ohio and said, either sell to me or I will crush you. Over 20 different oil companies sold to him out of fear, and those that didn't, how did he stop them? Well, what he would do is he would bribe railroad companies to ship empty rail cars rather than ship his rivals' oil, which meant if you can't ship your oil anywhere, well, you can't sell it. And so that leads him being able to control all the oil in Ohio, and then eventually he spreads to other regions. He also employed spies in government, other railroads, other competition. Basically, these underhanded methods is how he made his money, and that's all these ideas, whether it's Rockefeller, Morgan, whether it's Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould. This all encompasses that the economic profit of the Gilded Age is built on the back of the people. But unfortunately, almost all of it was done by these underhanded methods as they sought what I would call cutthroat businesses to just defeat each other by any underhanded means necessary. And then in what in the world category, what enables businesses to thrive is that the government declares that a corporation is a legal person. This stops them from being able to be sued individually, and instead the business itself is sued. But it also means that you can't deprive businesses of their property because they are people owning property. Companies can also, through the laws passed in the Gilded Age, they can also incorporate their business in any state they'd like. So let's say you had a business in California, but because their tax rates are so high, you would actually claim that your business was formed in a different state. The most famous state for this is Delaware. Delaware has one of the most lenient tax rates, and the laws on businesses are very lenient. And so, because of that, you have a lot of companies based in Delaware when really they don't have many offices. They may have only a P.O. box in Delaware. So you can see that there are a lot of different benefits. Also, back to the idea of laissez-faire, hands-off government. The government kept its hands off of businesses. They had very few regulations, very low tax rates. So because of that, businesses could do whatever they wanted. Here's a picture. You may see this on the AP test. This is a very popular cartoon. The idea that Standard Oil, which is the name of Rockefeller's company, was a sprawling octopus whose tentacles controlled all branches of the government. So the idea is that Rockefeller not only controls his industry, he controls all the politicians as well. There's another picture here of Rockefeller investigating the government buildings for wealth and how much money he can make. Of course, you see the government buildings also have Standard Oil Refinery written on it. So this brings us to, how did these people justify their actions? How can you look at this and say that it's okay that I'm treating people so poorly and stabbing people in the back? Well, they looked at it as what we call social Darwinism. Individuals win their stations in life by competing on the basis of their natural talents. The idea, like in nature, the weak species die out and the stronger species continue. So they took this idea and they said, hey, this is survival of the fittest. I outwork, I outsmarted, I outperform people that are beneath me. Those that I defeat, I'm just better than them. And just like in nature, no one, the lion doesn't feel bad for the gazelle that he captures and eats. So these businessmen also said, well, hey, that's just society. That's just the idea of Darwinism in society, that's social Darwinism. And so when they saw what they were doing to others, they said, I deserve what I'm getting, and others deserve what they get. So they had very little pity for the poor. One of the few businessmen who disagree with this idea, although not completely disagree, he understood it, but Carnegie wrote an essay called Gospel of Wealth. He claimed that the rich should use their money to improve society and provide opportunities for others. So out of the $400 million that he gets from selling Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan, he spends $350 million helping those beneath him. He claimed the rich should use their money by creating schools, libraries. Now, he was not big on handing out money. He wasn't just going to distribute the wealth. He was going to provide opportunities. So if you were a poor person who had no education or no opportunity, he would provide those free services that if you wanted to put the work in, you could improve yourself through that. So you have social Darwinism, you have the gospel of wealth, a different way of looking at it, but still wanting people to work. These debates over how to treat the poor and how the rich should be treated or should they be required to give their money would rage throughout all of the Gilded Age. And if you want to fast forward today, well, we still have a lot of debates with people thinking that the wealthy need to have a much higher tax rate, as well as other things like socialized health care, etc. Then finally, talking really briefly, what about workers? So you could guess that people like Carnegie and Rockefeller didn't really look at their workers that positively, or at least give them as much of a break. And so workers decide to form unions because they feel like that's the only way that they can be successful. So that brings us to the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor were one of the very first. The problem is they wanted the country to shift to socialism, and not the friendly socialism that most people seem to think that it is. They wanted people, the people, to control the means of production. In many ways, it was a communist anarchist society. So they welcomed everybody into their union, including immigrants, blacks, and women, which sounds progressive and I think is pretty great. The problem is they also welcomed some rather radical people like those anarchists I mentioned. And so although they gained a lot of members into their union fighting for their rights, better wages, working conditions, and hours, when the Haymarket Square riot sees a piece or a stick of dynamite thrown into a crowd, killing several police officers and other bystanders, this celebration turned violent ends up killing the Knights of Labor and their attempt to change society. So one of your first unions ends up collapsing, but that brings us to the successful union, the American Federation of Labor. Founded by a guy named Samuel Gompers, which is one of my favorite names in U.S. history, they focused, instead of massive social changes, they said, let's focus on the things that matter most to workers. Let's focus on hours, how many hours we have to work a day. Let's focus on the wages we're being paid, making those better, and our working conditions. And those three things, working hours, wages, and working conditions, are the three, quote, bread and butter issues that the unions under Gompers focused upon. So one way that they accomplished this is they focused only on allowing skilled laborers into their labor union, no women or unskilled workers. That's because skilled laborers would be people who were trained to do their job for months or years. So whereas someone working on an assembly line who only has to hammer in a couple nails and then he hammers in a couple nails again and more nails, if you're someone who's doing woodworking, creating precious handcrafted things, if you and your entire group go on strike, well, you can't be replaced easily like people in some of those easier factories. And so because of this, beginning with the AFL and their skilled labor unions, they are able to bring about success for workers, getting better wages, getting smaller amount of hours you have to work a day, and better working conditions. So the AFL under Samuel Gompers is one of the groups that sees a lot of gains. However, I do want to say before we leave this presentation that it is not until the Progressive Era that we see a lot of changes. The Gilded Age, for the most part, is an era where workers get nothing. They get nothing but stomped on and trampled on by businessmen, by their bosses, and even by the government. Okay, so that wraps up this chapter, mostly about rails and the things that our nation builds. How do we get to be so wealthy? Who succeeded? And then, of course, who was the victims of this success? So hopefully this has been a good video for you and helps you understand this chapter. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. See ya.